All right. Deuteronomy 11. Yes. Deuteronomy 11. So we're right here. We're right here at the end of this section. And I won't say too much more about that until we get to the end of chapter 11, because there's some cool stuff that links it to the frame and frames these chapters in the middle. It's just awesome. So let's just begin by reminding ourselves that the whole book of Deuteronomy is it's the law, which we've already had a lot of the law, but it's the law being preached. Remember? It was Moses at the plains of Moab, and he's preaching the Torah to the people, and he begins by the big locker room speech, the collection of sermons before we go out into the land. And so chapter 11 brings all the themes of the covenant sermons together here. It's really powerful. Let's go for it. Love Yahweh your God, and keep his requirements, his decrees, his laws, and his commands always. Remember today that your children were not the ones who saw and experienced the discipline of Yahweh your God. Now this is interesting. So we had the Exodus generation. What happened to them? So they died in the 40 years of wandering. And so Moses is addressing the second generation. So who's he talking about right here? Your children. What generation? So the third. We got already three generations. So this is really interesting. So you're already thinking about the next generation and how their story and experience is going to be completely different than the first two generations. And look at how he explores this. It's interesting. It's about passing on, not just passing on the faith, but thinking about how you maintain identity as a people throughout generations. So he says, remember today that your children, they weren't the ones who saw and experienced the discipline of Yahweh your God. His majesty, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, the signs he performed, the things he did in the heart of Egypt, both to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to his whole country, what he did to the Egyptian army, to its horses, to its chariots, how he overwhelmed them with the waters of the Red Sea as they were pursuing you, how Yahweh brought lasting ruin on them. They didn't see any of that. Now, those are events that you would remember. Those are events that would have a lasting, shaping impact on you. Yeah, your kids will not have that experience. In addition, it was also not your children who saw what he did for you in the desert. So there was the Exodus, but now there's the desert stories. Until you arrived here at this place. They didn't see what he did to Dathan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, the Reubenite, when the earth opened its mouth right in the middle of all Israel and swallowed them up with their households, their tents, and everything that belonged to them. It was your own eyes that saw all these great things Yahweh has done. Therefore, observe all the commands that I'm giving you today, so that you may have the strength to go in, take over the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess, and so that you may live long in the land that Yahweh swore to your forefathers to give to them, to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. So, at least at the moment, we're going to come back to the kiddos again, but at the moment, what's going to be the most significant witness to your children about the things that you've seen and experienced, but that they haven't seen and experienced? Does that question make sense? So far in the text, we're going to talk about the signs and things that we do to remind the kids, but at the moment, what is a witness to your kiddos? What does he say here? It's the first 7 verses. They didn't see this. Exodus, they didn't see that. Verse 8, obey. Obey. So far, the most significant witness to your kids is the fact that you obey. So it might seem kind of simple, but I think it's quite profound. He's going to go on to talk about how you talk about the Torah and you teach your kids and so on. But the first thing he mentions is simply your own life lived before the next generation is the first thing he brings up when he talks about your kiddos and the next generation. So when you go into the land, observe the commands, observe the Torah. Now this land, by the way, verse 10, this land you are entering to take over, it's not like the land of Egypt from which you've come, where you planted your seed and you irrigated it by foot, like a vegetable garden. Now, does everybody have foot there for verse 10? Irrigated it by foot? Do we all have? No. By what? You have a little footnote? By feet. Yeah, plural, by feet. Anything else? By feet. Watered it by feet. What does this mean? Nobody really knows what it means. So it's just one of these things where it's clearly a little idiom. It's a Hebrew idiom referring to something about like agricultural practices in Egypt. And so, one thing about Egypt, here's the difference. What is most of Egypt in terms of like climate and geography? Most of Egypt. Desert. What's the lifeline of agriculture and the economy of Egypt? The Nile. There you go. So if you know that, you basically get the idea. So if you want to have farms in Egypt, what do you somehow have to get from A to B? You have to get water from the Nile way, way inland somehow. So, there's all, scholars, they love this kind of thing. Ooh, a puzzling phrase that nobody knows what it means. And so there's like 5 different views. Is it referring to ancient foot pumps? Or is it referring to ancient water dikes that were operated by foot levers or something like, So anyway, something like that. But the land where you're going doesn't get its water from one main source and then human-made irrigation works. Where does it get its water? The land you're crossing in the Jordan to take possession of, it's a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from the sky, from the heavens. In other words, you're going to be completely dependent on God's provision for you as you go into this land. There won't be any way to do mass agriculture that you can plan and that's under your control. It's totally dependent on the elements, which I'm sure was true in Egypt too in a certain sense. But verse 12, this is a land Yahweh your God cares for. The eyes of Yahweh are on it. Yahweh your God are continually on it from the beginning of the year to its end. It's a beautiful line. So you have the special land. It's being given to you as a gift, and your life on it is going to be a gift. Even the food that you eat and your farming, it will all be a gift of provision, and it won't be like the way it operated in Egypt. So verse 13. So if you faithfully obey the commands I'm giving you today. How many calls to obey have we had so far in the chapter? Look at the first sentence. What are we told to do? Love and keep the requirements. Go down to verse 8. Observe all the commands I've given you today. And then verse 13, if you obey. This is interesting. Okay, so verse 13 has, if you faithfully obey. That's the New International Version. If you faithfully obey. Any other translations of that line? Carefully obey. Any others? If you indeed obey. Yeah, this is great. So let's see here. Sorry. That looks terrifying. Okay. This is a little feature of Logos, the Bible software I use that I like, because you can pull up a bunch of different translations all at once. So if you faithfully obey, if you indeed obey, if you listen obediently, New American Standard, if you will only heed, Ooh, King James, if ye shall hearken diligently. I love the King James. Okay, so this is a good one. Sorry, I should have done this earlier. This is a really cool little Hebrew turn of phrase. It's nearly impossible to reproduce in English. But in Hebrew, if you want to really emphasize something, you have a certain form of the verb, and you put the verb there once, and then you put it there a second time. So in Hebrew, it literally says, and this is so that's you put the word twice, and also this is interesting too, is that the word obey. There's no word for obey in the Old Testament. In English, we have this word obey that means adhering to a command. In Hebrew, how do we say this? The word obey in Hebrew is the word Shema, which you might know from the prayer called the Shema, and it's the first Hebrew word of the prayer. And how do we say that word in English? What do we say? Listen, or hear. So in Hebrew, there's no word for obey. The word is listen or hear. It's the same word that describes, you're listening to my voice right now. So every time you see the word obey in your Old Testament translations, it's literally the word listen. So that's cool. And then there's also the fact that right here, when you want to emphasize a certain idea, you just put the verb twice. And so in the most literal translation of to verse 13 would be, listen to the commands I'm giving you here today. That's great. Come on. Why doesn't any translation do that? You got to wonder. So you can see, so our English translations are, some English translations say, listen obediently, because the whole point is it's not just listening, the laws of the Torah or whatever. The whole point is you listen and respond. So maybe that would be a better way. It's not just that you're listening, but you're listening and then responding, and that's the concept here. So even the Shema prayer, listen, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your God. It's about this relational hearing and responding. Anyway, isn't that interesting? Think about the line that Jesus, it's a curious little line. He uses about half a dozen times in the Gospels. And he says to people, if you have ears, listen. This is what he says. If you have ears to hear, listen. It's a common line that Jesus throws out there. And I think it's informed by a lot of these passages in Deuteronomy here that are constantly calling people to listen. So, verse 13. So if you listen to the commands I'm giving you here today. And then we have spelling out what does it mean to listen? To love Yahweh your God and serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. Then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, your new wine, and oil. We're back to the rain and the farming. I'll provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat, and you'll be satisfied. So this is a big theme of what we're framing. The next chapter, we're going to move into the big block of laws. And so there's a whole bunch of themes right here. And we've come across this basic call before, that obedience to the Torah equals blessing. And blessing, not just in the form of Yahweh being like, oh, you're nice, I like you. It's in the covenant, it's tangible, physical effects of rain and crops and fertility and things like that. Life goes well for you if you obey. But if you don't obey, Does life go well for you? Mm-mm. Verse 16. Be careful, or you'll be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then Yahweh's anger, or some of you have his wrath. And remember, Yahweh's wrath is never arbitrary. It's never the volatile God. It's always, his wrath comes out of his justice for covenant violation, for people's rebellion and covenant violation. If Yahweh's angry at you, it's not a mystery why, right? You know why. It's because you did something to warrant it. So you'll be enticed to turn away to other gods. Yahweh's anger or wrath will burn against you. And he'll shut the heavens, and it's not going to rain. And the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land Yahweh is giving you. So, we'll say disobedience, or if we were going to be hyperliteral, we would say listening or not listening, right? And so I'm going to use the word curse right here, not in the sense of like magical omens and stuff like that, but in the terms of bad things happening precisely because of your behavior right here. Now, just as a to anchor this historically, this is Moses' sermon before they go into the land. But as you read through the story of Israel in the land, drought is actually one of it's an event that happens and it's noted a number of times throughout Israel's history. Can you think of the most famous drought in the Old Testament? This is good Bible trivia for some of you. This is the story of Elijah, the famous story of Elijah, you know? Elijah, he's introduced onto the scene. The first time he's mentioned in the story is Elijah the Tishbite saying to Ahab, "As Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." And so then there's a 2 or 3 year drought and then a famine. And then do you remember the story of how the rain comes eventually? He has the showdown with the prophets of Baal, and there's 400 of them, and there's one of him, and there's the 2 altars and the fire from heaven and all that kind of thing. And then after that all happens, he goes up onto a mountain and he has his servant with him, and then he sees the little cloud coming on the horizon, and he says, "It's the size of a man's fist," but then it grows, and then it's the first rain they've had. It's kind of an epic scene. Anyhow. So that's a story, and it doesn't say, well, all it says here is, "No rain except at my word." And so you're just supposed to know he's a prophet. Prophets are called to be watchdogs over the Torah and Israel keeping the Torah, and you're just supposed to know that this is happening because Israel's been disobedient. It doesn't say that right there, but you just know that because you've been reading the book of Deuteronomy, so you know how this goes. So, Deuteronomy 11, we have the kiddos. Your kiddos aren't going to know. How are they going to know? First of all, by your obedience, because your obedience or disobedience is going to have these real tangible effects. Blessing and abundance or lack of it. So, here's the next thing you can do for your kiddos. Look at verse 18 here. "So fix these words of mine in your heart and mind." Does everybody have heart and mind right there? In your heart and in your soul. Yeah, so interesting. So heart is similar in Hebrew. In Hebrew it's called lev. Your lev. And heart in Hebrew is not just where you feel things, like in our culture, but it's also where you think and where you make your decisions. So it's kind of a wider ranging concept because you feel and think and choose from your heart. You also feel, another place that you feel in the Bible is in your intestines. You feel things in your guts. And we say that in English, don't we? I had a gut feeling about this. So that they have that same idiom in Greek. So this word mind, or some of you have soul, this is a trickier word. This is the word nephesh. And nephesh is, man, we just don't have any equivalent for what this is in English. We just have a bunch of different English words to get around it. Soul here, especially in the Old Testament, is not referring to the immaterial part of you that's like separable from your material part. That concept doesn't really exist in the Old Testament. So your human beings do not have souls. Human beings are souls. You're a nephesh. That's what you are. You're a living being. So sometimes this word just gets translated as life. So, man, if you really start looking around your English translations, you'll see they really vary in how they render this word. Because in context, we might need different English words to pull down to try and get at it. So think about it. Start paying attention to how the word soul gets used, or life. And sometimes it means throat. You can grab someone by their nephesh. Isn't that interesting? Which literally means if you're grabbing their throat, but think, your throat is pretty central to who you are as a human being. If your throat's like constricted, what happens to you? You're a goner. Your very nephesh is extinguished if your throat gets grabbed. So add throat to the mix there. It's a really interesting concept. So what does it mean to follow God from your heart, from the place where you choose and think things through, but then follow God in your nephesh, in the very essence of your being is aligned with Yahweh? Yeah. So here's the first thing you do. You fix God's words on your minds and in your nephesh. And then tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Did Josh talk about this when you did the Shema chapter in Deuteronomy 6? Do you remember? That would have been a few weeks ago, because this concept comes up in Deuteronomy 6. So you have this metaphorical, fix the words, attach them to your heart and to your nephesh, but then you have this additional thing of these symbols. Tie them as symbols on your hands and on your forehead. Now, symbolically, hand and forehead, what's the meaning? What's the meaning of that? Forehead, hand. So it's about thinking and action, right? You do stuff with your hands and you think things through with your head and with your heart. And so there's already a symbolic element there, but what are you doing to your head and to your hands? You're tying symbols on them. You're putting symbols on your head and on your hands. So there's quite a long debate within Judaism about if this is also meant as a metaphor, just like the first line. Do you see how the first line is metaphorical? Fix the words on your heart and on your nephesh, and tie them or attach them to your hands, i.e. to everything that you do, and to your heads, where you think things through. Is it two metaphorical lines about fixing God's word in your being and mind and actions? Or is the first line a metaphor and the second line is actually a command to do some kind of symbolic thing on your hands and on your heads? And within one whole strand of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, they've taken the second line literally or metaphorically. Yeah, literally. So, here we go. Who knows what Google Images is going to give us right here. Wow, I don't even know who that is, but that's somebody. So there you go. Let's do a drawing instead of a Hollywood actress. So it's these leather straps right here that are wrapped around the hand, and then around the forearm and around the hand, and then a leather strap wrapped around the forehead, and then there's a little box in there. And inside of that little box is a tiny little paper scroll, and on that scroll is written the Shema prayer from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and a couple other passages too, one from Numbers and then one right here from Deuteronomy 11. So you both metaphorically and literally attach the Torah to your hands and to your head. Verse 19, you teach these commands to your children. So first, your very life and obedience is a testament to them, but then you talk about them. You talk about them when you sit at home. You talk about the Torah when you walk along the road. You talk about the Torah when you lie down to go to bed, and you talk about the Torah when you get up from bed. You write the commands of the Torah on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. So this is also a really common practice in Judaism. It's called, have you guys seen these? It's called the mezuzah. And it's usually some kind of box. It can be made out of whatever, plastic, metal, wood, or something. And at least within Jewish tradition, it's come to be kind of the cylinder. It's hollow inside. And you attach it to your door, like here on the door frame or something. But inside is the hollow section is a little scroll. And on that scroll is written the Shema prayer and these passages from Deuteronomy. And I don't know, you go to certain places in New York and you go anywhere in Israel and they're just everywhere. They're in businesses. You go into a grocery store and there'll be a little mezuzah on the entry of the grocery store and so on. So what's the point here? Verse 21, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land Yahweh swore to give your forefathers, as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth. So I don't know what you think about this. I kind of think this is a beautiful practice because it's these. What are you doing? You're of course fixing the Torah in your heart and mind. That's verse 18. So you have this practice of reading and immersing yourself, but you also, like, your memory's faulty and our memories are fickle, right? And so what you're doing is you're giving yourself these physical anchors in your life that are just woven into day-to-day life, and you see them and you remember. Which I somehow within at least Protestant Christianity, there's been sometimes an aversion away from putting these kinds of physical symbols in your life. And I can understand it to a certain degree. Because without a proper understanding of the gospel and what these symbols are for, you can begin to attach kind of magical or superstitious significance to them. But as long as that's really clear in your mind, these kinds of things, I think, are huge, huge aids to us. So, what different symbols like this can function differently for us. The feast days of the calendar, the Jewish calendar, or the Christian calendar, I think, serve a lot of the same purpose. So think about it. These are, just think about it. It's worth thinking about. And in this case, it's about the role of Scripture in the daily life of God's people. What are some symbolic ways that you can put things in your path or in your normal day-to-day routine that remind you of who you are, of who God is, and the Scriptures? That's the practice here. And within family life, having tiny kids, having kids, but having a family is all about repetition, it seems to me, right? Because kids thrive on structure and repetition. And so, putting stuff in day-to-day life and you're like, really, it's the 100th time we've said this prayer, buddy. But it's really important that we've said this prayer for the 100th time, because there's something about their little minds that it weaves. You're weaving their sense of reality by that repetition for ourselves, but also for little kids. Okay, sorry, this is not about parenting. Verse 22. If you carefully observe, here we are again. If you carefully observe all the commands I'm giving you to follow, to love Yahweh your God to walk in all his ways, and to hold fast to him. Oh, there's all these interesting things. Sorry. So notice we've had the word love multiple times in this chapter, haven't we? Love Yahweh your God. What's the first line of the chapter? Love Yahweh your God. And then how is it qualified? Love is always joined with obedience. Do you see? Look at the first line. Love Yahweh your God, keep his requirements. We just had it right here. Verse 22. If you carefully observe all these commands I'm giving you to follow, to love Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways, then. So just, sorry, there's all these asides, but I think the asides is where all the good stuff is. Where did I? Oh, yes. So there's a well-known passage, or at least it should be well-known to because it's so powerful, in Jesus' upper room discourse. And he leads a whole line of thought with this line right here. If you love me, what are you going to do? You're going to obey. And the language he uses is right from Deuteronomy, isn't it? Love, keep my commands. In this case, however, it's not just you out of your own sheer willpower. It's I'm going to ask my Father, and he's going to give you another advocate to help you, be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. So you have Spirit-empowered obedience to the Torah, and that's wrapped up with the New Covenant and Ezekiel and all that kind of thing. But this is a big theme down here in verse 21. Whoever has my commands and keeps them, that's the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and so on. So it seems to me Jesus read his Bible. That's the only point I'm making here. And his very language is shaped by the book of Deuteronomy. Did you know that Jesus quotes, if you read the Gospels, he quotes from the book of Psalms and the book of Deuteronomy more than any other books of the Old Testament, and Isaiah comes in third. Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. Verse 23. So if you observe and love and obey, then Yahweh will drive out all of these nations before you, and you will dispossess the nations larger and stronger than you. Every place where you set your foot will belong to you, from the desert to Lebanon, that's from south to north, from the Euphrates River to the western sea, that's from east to west. No human will be able to stand against you. Yahweh, your God, just as he promised you, will put the terror and fear of you on the whole land wherever you go. Last paragraph, which for a preacher, it's where the money is, right there. Last paragraph before we go into the laws here. He says, look, I am setting before you today blessing and curse. Your choice. Let me just make it very stark and clear. Blessing, if you obey, or literally in Hebrew, if you listen to the commands, Yahweh your God, that I'm giving you today. And the curse, if you don't listen to the commands of Yahweh your God and turn away from the way I'm commanding you today by following other gods, which, by the way, you don't know these gods. You're not in a covenant relationship with them. They didn't rescue you. Why would you follow them? It's ridiculous. But there you go. You may choose to do that. Verse 29, when Yahweh your God has brought you into the land that you're entering to possess, here's one more symbol, one more symbolic act that you're to engage in. So first of all, your obedience is a symbol to your children. Then also engage in these other symbols about hand and forehead and scripture on your doorposts and so on. But here's the ultimate symbolic act. When you go into the land you're entering to possess, you are to proclaim on Mount Gerizim the blessings and proclaim on Mount Ebal the curses. Now, as you know, these mountains are across the Jordan. They're west of the road, or towards the west, towards the setting of the sun, near the great trees of Moreh, wonderful forest. You know, the forest of Moreh, because we've all been there. Right? in the territory of those Canaanites living in the Arava in the vicinity of Gilgal. So let's pause here. So this is really interesting, and act as a frame. Put your thumb right here. Well, actually, no, don't put your thumb. Well, do put your thumb, but first look at the first sentence of chapter 12. So we're told all these symbols to remind you of obedience, and then go to these two mountains. Look at the first sentence of chapter 12. Okay, here we are now. We've been telling you to obey the commands. Now here they are. These are the decrees and the laws you must be careful to follow in the land. And it goes on for whatever that is, 15 chapters or something. Turn to chapter 27 with me. So chapter 26 ends the laws by describing the feast calendar. And chapter 26 ends with a little final paragraph that actually reads a lot like the sermons right here. Look at chapter 26, the last paragraph of chapter 26. Yahweh your God commands you this day, follow all of these decrees and laws, carefully observe them with all your heart and all your soul. And we're like, oh, I just read that in chapter 11, didn't I? So you have this framework around about obedience. I mean, all these themes. We have obedience, we have this word love, obeying with all your heart and with your nephesh, and whatever we'll put with your soul. All this language framing this. But then we have this symbol that we're going to do on these two mountains, and then look at chapter 27, which if you have a heading or some kind of chapter title, what's the chapter title for Deuteronomy 27? Yeah, something about this altar on Mount Ebal, which was just mentioned at the end of chapter 11. So Deuteronomy 27, keep all these commands. Moses and the elders commanded the people, keep the commands I give you today. When you've crossed the Jordan into the land Yahweh your God is giving you, get some huge stones and coat them with plaster. Right? So, and what's that for? If you're covering it with plaster, then you're giving yourself a soft surface to etch something, carve something into. And you're to write or to carve all the words of these laws on these stones. When you've crossed over to enter the land Yahweh is giving you, and then go down to verse 9. So they go up to Mount Ebal, and then Moses and the priests and the Levites, they said to all Israel, be silent, Israel, listen. You've become the people of Yahweh your God. Obey Yahweh your God. Follow his commands and decrees that I give you today. On the same day, Moses commanded the people, when you've crossed the Jordan, these tribes go stand on Mount Gerizim, and they're going to shout blessings over the people, over these tribes. And then verse 13, these tribes go stand on this opposite mountain, Ebal, and they're going to shout the curses of the covenant. And then that's what they do in 27. You have a bunch of people on this mountain, and they're shouting like, blessed are you if you obey. And then you have this other group on this mountain, and they're shouting, cursed are you if you disobey. And that's what they're going to do. And you go read the book of Joshua, and they do this big symbolic act. So you have right here this big symbolic act of the two mountains. This is like a tale of two mountains, not two cities, but a tale of two mountains right here. Now, in terms of geography of these two mountains, this is what's interesting. Some of you saw me pulling up pictures of this. So these two mountains in the region, these are the two mountains. Those are the mountains. So obviously, we look at that and we're like, oh, Mount Tabor, you mean? It's about the size of Mount Tabor. Exactly. When the word Bible uses the word mountain, it's usually referring to something like this. So there it is. And you're facing east right here. And let's see, I think I got a big map. Here we go, yeah. So we've got Dead Sea down here, Sea of Galilee up here, Jerusalem, Jordan River between the two, and here we go. Here's the two mountains. So if you're facing east, inland, Mount Ebal is on your left, Mount Gerizim is on the right. And from Gerizim, the right mountain, you're shouting blessing. From Mount Ebal, from on the left or on the north, you're shouting curses. And so you can see they're actually quite close to each other. You got a group of people up here and a group of people down here. And the town in between the two was the Israelite town of Shechem, or Shechem. Right now, it's in the West Bank. It's the Palestinian city of Nablus. But anyway, and then I found this little picture, which has way too much text on it, but it's kind of helpful. Because the whole point is that it's just a mile in between them. And if you see, this is actually the way the hills are shaped. Do you see it shaped like a huge bowl? Do you see it? It's a big U shape over here in this hill, and then a big U shape over here. So you can't see that from this picture, but you can see it from an aerial photo. And so one group standing here, one group standing here, and it really is like this big, huge stadium where you can hear, and the words echo in the big canyon where the town is. Isn't that interesting? So this is a unique place. There's nothing else quite like this in terms of geography. And so that's surely why these two mountains were chosen. It's this gigantic natural amphitheater. Scientists have tested this natural amphitheater, and it works. That's wonderful. Great. Of course it works. They worked 3,000 years ago, too. So that's the idea here. So this is the ultimate symbolic act. You do these big stones, you have the things on your foreheads, and you have on your doorposts, but who could forget this? You know what I mean? Doing this, you get thousands of people together, and you're shouting over the course of a mile the words of the Torah back and forth to each other. What an awesome experience. Church in the park tonight. Come on, I think we just got our idea. Maybe not. Let's go back. Let's finish Deuteronomy 11. So the two mountains, you're shouting blessing and curse. Verse 31. You're about to cross over the Jordan. You're about to enter and take possession of the land Yahweh your God is giving you. When you have taken it over and are living there, be sure to listen to all of the decrees and laws that I'm setting before you today. I mean, he can't say it many more times, can he? So notice we're not going to even try and touch 12, because 12 is a whole other world of awesomeness. Oh yes, I forgot to say this. Year of Torah next week? No. Remember, no Year of Torah next week. Sorry, I'll miss you, and I'll be thinking about you. and I asked a bunch of people, and just everyone happens to be out of town who I would normally ask to do it. So sorry, summer vacation. We'll see you on the 16th. Okay, that's an aside. So how many times have he called them to obey in this chapter? Feel free to count it up. It's like every paragraph begins and ends and has somewhere in the middle with this call to obey. So we have this call to a choice. I mean, this really, he's putting before them this choice. And you get to choose not just like what you're going to do with the covenant, but essentially you're choosing like how your life works out for you. Do you want blessing or do you want curse? I mean, he's a preacher. He's framing it in very stark terms right here. And we're going to have all these symbols to remind you that this choice is in front of you. We're going to do this big, crazy, awesome group learning experience on the mountains, and that's going to fix in your memory too. But this is the basic idea. Now here's what's interesting. So Deuteronomy sets up this scheme here. Covenant obedience, blessing. Covenant disobedience equals curse. Now, does this play itself out in the history of Israel to follow? Yeah, it does for the most part, like in the story of Elijah. The ultimate curse is going to be getting kicked out of the land that was given to them as a gift, and that's totally going to happen. But this way of framing things also raises a bunch of questions, doesn't it? Because what about the people who remained obedient even when the majority disobeyed? Like, what happened to them? Like, think about a Daniel, for example. I mean, he ended up in exile in Babylon. And what did Daniel ever do wrong? He didn't do anything wrong. So this whole scheme also raises a whole bunch of other questions of like, well, okay, this is true of the people as a whole. That's what we're talking about here, the people as a whole. But within that whole people, there might be some that disobey and some that obey. And how do you work out all of that? What do you do when there are things that seem like curses raining down on your life, but actually you haven't really disobeyed at all? Can you think of a book of the Bible that's dedicated to that question? This is the book of Job. So actually, it's interesting. A lot of the wisdom literature of the Bible is dedicated to exploring either reinforcing this. Think what wisdom book of the Bible explores this personally, not for a whole people group, for you personally. The book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is it's just like reads like Deuteronomy, but for your life. If you're wise, you'll experience blessing. If you're stupid and selfish, you'll get this. But then you have alongside it books like Job or Ecclesiastes that say, yes, this is true for the covenant, and it's often true in our individual lives, but not always. Not always. So you have Ecclesiastes who's like, listen, I obeyed and I got cursed, and I have this neighbor who disobeys and he gets the hookups all the time, and what's that about? So anyway, that's the framework of the wisdom literature in the Bible, is to explore how this is true, but how sometimes it doesn't tell the whole truth. But for the covenant with Israel, this is totally, as with the nation as a whole, this is the framework. And they're given this choice. And you don't just blindly obey, grit your teeth and bear it or whatever. You actually, obedience comes with its own inherent blessing. It's like learning a language. It's hard to learn a language, and there's a lot of rote memory. You have to bring little memory, vocab cards. Any second language learners? How many of you did Spanish or German in high school, even something? Yeah, there you go. It's hard work to learn a language. And there's a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of doing things you don't want to do. But the thing about learning a language is you don't have to simply wait until the end to get the good thing. You actually, not very far in, start to actually be able to read and speak and comprehend. And so the blessing is included within the act of obeying the rules of the language itself as you learn it. And I think that's a good analogy for what Moses is getting at here, is that obedience brings about the fruit of its own consequences in being able to speak and live in a new way. So there's a whole bunch of themes going on here that I think are really profound and significant. So let's conclude, and let's just kind of focus as we pray and conclude, and just think about where you're at. Think about some practical ways that you could tie things on your hands or foreheads, metaphorically or literally, whatever. Get some tattoos. It's Portland, by the way. You could do it that way. You could do a lot of different things, but how could you build into your life some very practical symbols to remind you of who you are and of the gospel? And then also just this very simple but profound concept about our choice, and that God honors the dignity of our choices in obedience or disobedience, and that it comes with its own reward inherent in the act. How you guys doing? I'll conclude in prayer.